Good morning and welcome to Martechify. I would like to welcome everyone from coast to coast of the United States and across the seas over in the European area and other countries. We are so glad that you're here today. After we give a quick welcome, we'll do some administrative items, but I wanted to let you know what Martechify is and what we are all about. Martechify is a community of professionals who are interested in learning more about Martech, sharing best practices, and just getting together to share what we can do together. With that said, the administrative items are that you will see a chat and a QA bubble to the right of your navigation. Please use those for questions and answers and comments. We want this to be a very interactive session. You have joined the Blue Jeans Event Studio on mute. As time permits, we will unmute people with the raising of your hand. You can use the little hand icon to get in or let us know in the chat and we will promote you to be able to speak. And with that, I'd like to introduce Rich Herbst, our moderator today from Ascend Marketing, and he will be introducing our guest panelists.
Well, good morning, everybody, and good afternoon on the East Coast and beyond. Welcome to Martechify, and a special welcome to our guest experts this morning. I think we have a really good conversation lined up. So Maxine Island is with us. She has been a Martechify expert before. In earlier times, she was a marketing leader at SalesPoint and also Okta. More recently, she is at home caring for a brand new baby. Congratulations, Maxine. And she is also has her own digital transformation consulting practice. So welcome. We have Benjamin Murray, who has been part of earlier roundtable discussions as well. Benjamin we know from Nokia, but now he is the Director of Marketing Operations and Analytics at Cradlepoint. So he is the guy that leads operations and oversees all of the tech stack, very relevant for our conversation today. And welcome also to Andreas Halber. He leads the team at Blue Jeans, the Blue Jeans part of Verizon that also oversees the tech stack. High emphasis on automation, but a whole suite of tools surrounding that. So welcome. Let's dive into the conversation. I'll get us started, and then we'll get some commentary going, some dialogue going. Let's roll ahead a slide. Our last session was in February. And the last session related to what we're talking about today. In the last session, we looked at Martech stacks and technologies and how they're evolving. Really interesting discussion. For those of you who weren't able to join for that one, it is available via video in the Martechify website. Today is like an extension of that conversation. So we're going to look at Martech stacks and how the pieces fit together, which starts kind of with the framing, what are the pieces and what does the journey of a Martech stack look like? Our experts will lead us into some deeper discussion around use cases, examples, and advice from the field, if you will. We'll dialogue around that together and then wrap up toward the end of the hour. And so we can skip ahead from here. Our first picture of the day is actually the Martech landscape slide. Can we go ahead a slide, please? For those of you like me who have been following this slide or this body of work for the last years, I think I started following in about 2014. This slide, which basically maps all the marketing technologies or the main ones out there, has mushroomed, and we now have 11,000 separate technologies available from our tech stacks. And the word to me that goes with that is, wow, what a sprawling, messy landscape. So makes it hard to think about, hard to map, and then managing it is a whole nother story. And so, yeah, let's talk with our experts a bit. Question number one is, where do you even start? What's the foundation of the platform? This slide here is just simply a listing of the headers from the slide before. The big sections and then the subsection headers. So this is how at least Scott Brinker and others organize the landscape. Where do we start, I think, is question number one. And actually, let's roll ahead one more slide. Maxine, would you like to lead us off on that? What do you think is the foundation? Where does the work typically start, or what's the ground level of planning a stack?
I think that when you're looking at the landscape that's out there, it's a little daunting, right? There's a lot out there. There's a lot of different technologies. Like every day, there's a new one out there. So I think when you're looking at where you should focus your efforts, it's picking something that can really help your business at where it's at that moment, and something that can be implemented in a way that can be, push the needle a little bit more for your business, no matter what size it is, right? So if it's a small company, maybe it's just, an email platform or an ad platform versus a larger scope. Maybe it's reinventing, your Marketo or your Salesforce. And I'll talk a little bit more about the governance side of it and when we kind of jump into my slides. But from the get-go, I think that's a big portion of where do you even start, right? It's very overwhelming right now.
Yeah, but it sounds like what I kind of hear popping out of your comments, the natural starting place is the automation platform, the Marketo or similar, and the data, CRM, Salesforce. Benjamin, Andreas, what are your thoughts?
I can go first. I think for me, the biggest key for me is kind of to check out what do you have right now, right? Are you stepping into a role where you're inheriting a marketing automation platform, a CRM, a web tool that's already in some phase of maturity? Are you building from the ground up, right? I think the idea of building an entire tech stack from the ground up that's not going to happen very often. More times than not, you're going to step into a situation where you're inheriting, tech pieces that other people set up, right? There's probably not going to be much documentation, let's be honest. Documentation is like this unicorn that everybody wants to do really well, but nobody ever has time to do, right? And especially since it's iterative. So I think for me, it's taking a look at what data do you have, what tech stack tools do you have currently, and then pivoting, okay, if I have this today, this is model A, where do we want to go in the next 3, 6, 9 months, and then roadmap and iterate from there.
Yeah, and when I think of it's hard for me to think of a typical foundation anymore. When I remember looking at that slide that we looked at before with the technology, and I remember a time where you could actually distinguish what those logos were and recognize them and see what those companies were. So it wasn't like you had a lot of variety in some of those things, but I think it's based on like what your company's goals are. If it's more thought leadership, trying to focus more on things that are going to be web related, that aren't necessarily focused on the individual person and what they're doing, but to be able to build a web journey or to get engagements. And so I think your typical foundation has to do with what your goals are. There's always, like you mentioned, Rich, CRM, automation, and you've got to store that information somewhere. So those are some of the core components, but it really has to align with what your business goals are, with what your purpose is, and making sure that you can build that picture. Because at the end of the day, you're creating that visualization and you're trying to tell a story with us.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And I think, Andreas, you mentioned it, that it's not very often these days that you really get to pick a starting point for a new platform. I think that's true. Although sometimes, we see where a platform gets rebuilt or gets taken up to an entirely new level, in which case you might be looking at, what is the core? What is the core of this new platform? Let's move ahead a slide. I'd like to get into some of the discussion around your sharing, but I'd like to talk, before we get into the expert sharing, I'd like to just get very clearly out in the open what can go wrong in tech stack deployment, evolution, management. Maxine, you mentioned governance. Let's kind of start a mental list here. What are the big things that could be the traps or the potholes and roadblocks?
Literally everything. anything and everything can happen, right? From, I think, just the actual implementation and doing the connections wrong to, as you mentioned, the organizational challenges. Midway through an implementation, I've had people roll off completely and you're left with half a product, right, implemented, and then you're trying to figure out and scramble to either backfill somebody that's going to help support it or put it on pause and reassess, and then you have the whole contractual stuff that goes along with that as well. So those are just a few things that jump out immediately to me.
Yeah, I think lack of vision of scope end to end, right? You can get into data silos and building things for a purpose that doesn't align to other ones. Maxine mentioned, partial integrations. If you don't know what you were trying to do with implementing that tool or adding that tool to your stack in the first place, if you start to lose vision of that, it's really hard. And if you're not cognizant of where that information is going to wind up, it may not be formatted correctly, or you wind up with more problems trying to add it on to other information that will augment or give you better insights, which is, the goal in the first place.
Yeah, I think to build off of what Benjamin said, for me, it's always going to be data silos. I think at the end of the day, when you don't have a fully, if you can't follow the data from point A all the way to the end, you're always going to wind up with systems that don't speak to each other correctly, that are reporting different numbers for the same thing. And that's when you start getting into some issues where your external stakeholders aren't going to trust the system. They're not going to trust the reports that they could pull out of the system. And then you're going to have to kind of work to build back that trust with your external stakeholders. And there's a ton of bias when it comes to looking at data and looking at reports. And I'll get into that more when we get into the sharing section. So for me, it's always going to be data silos and just making sure that the tech stack is actually fully, integrated and aligned with itself.
Makes good sense. All right. Well, with pitfalls in mind, let's go into some real life sharing here. Maxine will lead us off, and Maxine has led, entire marketing functions as well as, overseeing tech stacks. So take it away, Maxine.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So, for me, I really wanted to focus on the governance piece of planning. There's so many areas you can dive into with governance, but I think oftentimes the actual planning before you purchase something is something that gets left behind, and then you bought something, right, because you thought it was a great new thing that you absolutely needed. And so I think before you even go forth and purchase something, there's a few things that you need to be making sure that you have, asked yourself these questions, that you've got the right buy-in. And the first, and that's the first one is to me is the most important, is understanding who's that owner of that technology, right? There can be either everybody in it or nobody in it. And so if you don't have a true owner, you oftentimes will run into a lot of issues along the way. Secondly is really making sure that you've assessed that you are looking at the right tool. Are you looking at something in one specific area, or should you be looking at something that maybe encompasses a multitude of different things that could help your business? Third is the roadmap and understanding the growth of your business. So something that you're purchasing right now, will it be able to expand as your business is expanding in the future? And knowing are there different features that you need to be able to implement later on online? Is your business going to branch into a different product where you might need to pivot a little bit? So ask yourself a little bit more of those deeper questions surrounding just your future growth. And then lastly is really figuring out, what are the metrics and the ways that you want to make sure that this specific thing that you're implementing is the right thing for your business, and also that it's working for your business. And so we'll dive into each one of these a little bit, the first being the ownership piece of it. So I always recommend very clearly defining the ownership from the get-go with one main point person. That's the person that's the day-to-day, right? Like that person has to be looking at this tool every single day. And I say that because connections break every day. There's data errors that happen. So somebody needs to be that point person where even if it's just once a day, they're just checking the system, making sure the system's okay, or they're getting some kind of a notification, right, if something fails with that specific tool. In addition to that, depending on the size of your business, you may or may not be able to have one or two backup people. So if that main point person goes on vacation or they go on maternity leave for 4 months, who is going to be the person that's going to be helping them support that tool? Two is always recommended just because, that's just an extra person as a backup that understands how the system works. People leave as well, right? When people leave companies, that oftentimes will leave a big gap. So the more people that understand the system, they don't necessarily need to understand all of the ins and outs of it. But making sure that there's really firm documentation for that platform. Everybody knows who the contact people are, et cetera, for that vendor. And then the third really valuable piece is making sure that you have an executive sponsor in some capacity, whether that be your CMO or CRO or somebody that's your director. You have to make sure that there's somebody that understands at the higher level why this tool is important. As if somebody comes in that wasn't there when this tool was originally purchased, they can come and slash that tool, right? Because they won't see why that's important, or they have their own opinions on a tool. So I think, having the documentation of not only what things that you looked at and why you chose this one, but also understanding the value of that tool and what it can bring to your business. And so ultimately, this will protect that specific technology, both in the short term and in the long term, as I mentioned. Secondly, looking at the validation piece. So again, making sure that you have validated the right tool for your business. You've looked at competitors both internally and externally, and I mentioned internally because I think either Andreas or Benjamin mentioned, if you come in and you're taking ownership of a tech stack, there might be some things in there that maybe need to be rethunk a little bit, or maybe there's another department that's using something that might be able to just extend it to what you need, especially if you're looking for something in the short term or you want to test a tool. Those are things that I find very valuable in just making sure that you're assessing the landscape that's out there. And then looking at the new tools that are coming out, right? People are always buying tools, or bigger platforms like Salesforce, right? Like they're always branching out and buying smaller companies, and so they're adding different features. That's another valuable piece to that. And then I touched a little bit on this, but really understanding where your current state is with your business and what you need right this moment versus what is something that's going to grow and grow with you, or something that maybe in a year we're going to have to pivot, right? So, but knowing that ahead of time, because sometimes these tools take longer to pivot than others do, right? Some are plug and play and some are just very, very well integrated, like a Marketo. And then looking at the impacts of the business and the technology. So there's positive and negative impacts, right? When you add a tool, positive can be, we're able to see our data clearly. We're able to see who's on our website and what they're doing. But then on the flip side, there's also could be some negative things that might be implicated that you need to take a look at and figure out how to tackle those things. And it's not always necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that you need to make sure that you are really diving into a little bit more. And looking at the growth piece of it. So it's really, looking at, again, what you're doing today and what you want to be doing. Where's the business going to over the next 6 to 12 months, knowing that anything you plan out in 12 months may or may not happen, right? But when you're looking at key features for a tool, those are things that should be planned out and implemented, because that's ensuring that that tool is functioning to its full capacity and that you're getting the biggest bang for the buck, right? I think oftentimes, right, we buy things and then we only have to implement them because we stop somewhere along the line or we don't plan out all the other features that need to be integrated. So those are key things as well to keep into consideration. And then as you're, rolling out this platform or tool, make sure that you're really learning and understanding what's working, what's not. So that way, when you're looking at and assessing it later down the line, you're able to understand how it's actually working towards your business. And then when you're looking at this roadmap, as you plan it out, you're able to really work together with other teams, say your IT team that needs to actually do some of the integrations or development. you're freeing up those resources later down the line because they know to expect that this will be coming through versus something you have to kind of get in line for, if you will, because there's so many competing people trying to get things integrated and implemented within the business. So the more that you can plan ahead and get people on board ahead of time, the better, and the more ease your implementations will go in your additions to the features. And then lastly, it's really looking at what are the upcoming features, for that specific tool. Are they going to be expanding into something new? Are they rolling a new feature out that's going to be of a benefit to your specific, your team? So, and that kind of rolls into the success piece. And so how are you, you can go to the next slide, able to measure out if this tool is functioning properly for your business? So I always recommend quarterly internal business reviews, and that means within your business and your company, anybody that's really touching this tool or has some type of day-to-day, work with this tool, bring them to the table, ask them, how has this been working for you? What could we be doing better? Are there features that you wish that it could be doing? I know we've done this. I've done this in the past, and it's worked really, really successfully. Especially, between marketing and sales, something like a Salesforce or a Drift, you're able to see what the problems are between the two, and it really kind of, I think, brings the partnership a little bit deeper and closer together. And then, there's the quarterly business reviews that you should be doing within your vendors themselves, right? And one thing I want to mention with this specific, quarterly business review is vendors will always inflate their numbers. And so they're always going to be saying that they brought you millions and millions of dollars of revenue. I saw this with Drift. There's no way they know that they're doing that, right? Because it's not a one tool that is doing one very specific thing to trigger somebody. They're just adding to the marketing mix. So I always say quarterly business reviews take it with a grain of salt, because you really should be managing that data and the revenue and everything that's associated with this specific tool on yourself internally, because you're the one that has the numbers and the right data, right? Not your vendor. They're going to inflate their numbers to make themselves look good and make you want to buy their product again and renew. And then checking again, making sure that there's not people out there doing something better or something that's cheaper or better equipped for what your business goals and needs are. And then looking at, if you need to pivot to a new vendor, what's the timeline associated with that, right? And one other piece that I want to add to this is that making sure that you're looking at the single source of truth for what your data should be, so that everybody's looking at the right metrics and reporting the same. And I think Andreas will go a little deeper on that. But as you're implementing, there are tools that will do very similar types of reporting. But as a business unit, you need to make sure that you are all reporting out on the same numbers. Otherwise, sales is reporting one thing and marketing is reporting, right? And so lastly, kind of the big key takeaway that I had is really don't buy the big new shiny toy without any type of governance or support in place. It's a very big, easy thing to do. I've had CMOs be like, we need Drift, we need Drift, we need Drift, but they don't have anybody internally to support it. We don't have the framework or the organizational structure to support it, so it fails. Now, is that the tool or is that the business? It's hard to tell whenever you don't have the true planning associated with it.
Good stuff. Thanks, Maxine. Hey, just one follow-up question for you. I'm curious, in the work you've done, the companies you've led, how big were these stacks that you were overseeing, and how much change? Like considering new components each year or rolling out new technologies. Can you paint the picture of just how big that was and how?
Yeah, I mean, so I've done small like companies that are just starting out. We're just rolling out their tech stacks, right? So you're looking at what are the foundational things that you need for that business, and that varies, right? I could say it's emails, it's your website platform, it's scheduling bookings, whatever it might be, but really that varies depending on your business. So figuring out what are your goals and the things that you're trying to achieve that year, and then look at how the tech stack can support that and make your life easier. And then on the larger scale, I mean, we've done huge overhauls where we've shifted from over into Marketo from another platform. We've done huge website migrations. I've done really big Salesforce migrations. So it really, the level of what you're looking at is huge. So as your company grows and your business is growing, make sure your tech stack grows, but make sure your tech stack is growing in a way where you can manage and maintain and handle it. Because there's also the maintenance side of these tools, right? And I didn't necessarily go into that, but that's another piece of it. Is, when there's new updates and just even like bug fixes, right? Some of these tools have regular maintenance that need to happen. And so I think you need to understand that as well when you're purchasing your tools and your tech stack, because you have to make sure that people are able to support this. Again, it just goes back to the planning piece and making sure that you're checking all the boxes off, right? And making sure that you're doing your due diligence as you're, purchasing.
Good deal. Well, let's pivot to Benjamin. Thanks, Maxine. So Benjamin, again, Director of Marketing Operations and Data Analytics at Cradlepoint. And knowing Benjamin, I really appreciate his depth around not only the operations and things like automation, but he goes especially deep on data. So, yeah, ready to hear your thoughts, Benjamin.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Rich. I think that's Rich's kind way of telling me to keep it above the weeds a little bit and get through this. I have that tendency to ramble, and I'll fight that. But I appreciate Maxine also queuing up just some really important things. I love the idea that she talked about is making sure that you have a goal. At the end of the day, all of the technology in the world and all of the stacks and all of the pieces we're added are built and designed to give insights into the business and how it's operating. If you start to stray or deviate from that, you start to lose sight of what you're doing in the first place. So I think making sure that you have that always present as you're building, as you're trying to gather data and insights, and as you're presenting that is going to be paramount to success. Also paramount to that success is making sure that you're aligning on your stakeholders' benefits, how you can help them to make sure that they're showing their successes as well. And when it comes time for buy-in and comes time for evaluation, that's going to go a long way as well. So I was laughing earlier about making the decisions based on you have to have a balance of pragmatism and creativity, like with Drift. You don't want to choose a new chat feature because it has more emojis than the other one. They're not going to translate through the system, and while it may be a little bit engaging, it's really hard to quantify. So make sure, again, you're back to business goals and you're back to things that'll move the needle. I think sometimes as marketers, we're still always fighting that concept of marketing as a cost center versus marketing as a revenue generator. Like, the stack and the data is really what gives us the ability to change people's minds about that. And keeping that present, keeping that top of mind as you're building through and as you're building your vision is really important. And we talked a lot about change and how things come in and out. I think for me, one of the keys to success is having that agile mentality of, as I'm building things in, making sure, again, they're documented and it's clear how they connect. So business plans change, budgets change, leadership changes, all of that changes. Knowing that that's going to happen and that's inevitable can help you build around that so that the cost of change and the impact of change is less detrimental, or it's not going to end your world. Like, it's okay, this is just another reorg, we're going to flow with it, we're going to work on it, and we're going to put in this new piece. It's totally cool. One of the ways that I found helpful to do that is narrowing down that focus. We've talked about what our baseline is and what our core is. And so if you can find 3 to 5 systems in your stack, and that may be a little conservative, but making sure that you've got those working really well together to build a reliable foundation for your data is going to be monumental in long-term goals, not just short-term successes. And what do I mean by core systems? On the next slide, we look at what are some examples of those core systems. So when I'm saying that, typically I'm talking about your CRM, marketing automation, which Rich mentioned earlier. And again, Maxine mentioned, it really depends on what your business does and what their goals is. If you're e-commerce, there's going to be some heavy e-commerce stuff in your core systems. If you're B2B, there's a lot of CRM focus on that to keep your accounts and your opportunities in place. Paid digital is always going to be a core component of that. And I've included a couple things which other people may overlook. The data warehouse and where you store your data is really important, because the way that you get it out and to use it is incredibly important. And then I put campaign hierarchy or request tool in here, that leaving the breadcrumbs along with your data so that you can get it back out and you can draw those insights and you can do roll-ups and you can get closer to an ROI of these things. to me, that's been a game changer as I've built, and especially as you get into more complicated stacks and more complex layouts, having those breadcrumbs to diagnose backwards and to be able to match your source systems to your reports and getting that data lined up is super important. So on the next slide is a visual that this is how I like to kind of look at this, and this is kind of a view that I came up a few years ago of how data kind of moves end to end, right? So on your left, you've got your source systems and where you're gathering the data. In the middle, we've got some categories that help us. These are just common categories that we use in our reporting and common things that we use, buckets that we put our information in. And then on the right, you'll see your outputs, which are those dashboards. Being able to focus on your data, how it flows, how it moves, how it groups end to end is really important to build in the agility and flexibility and not be constrained by what your system tells you need or what your core system or the collection system tells you need. Once you can kind of break down some of those barriers and say, no, this is to augment people information, or this is to add on to my behavior information, or to give me information for segmentation, like knowing the benefit of the information you're going to get out of the system makes a huge change in how you view what you're going to add to that and getting those gaps. So super important thing about when you're looking at it this way is what I call a common thread approach. As you're adding these systems and as you're building onto your stack and augmenting your stack, is make sure that you can connect the dots from end to end. Make sure that the information you're getting on the left in the source system will contribute on the right. You may have to do some ETL and cleanup and normalization, but it's still with the goal that it's painting a bigger, more complete picture. So on the next slide, we have kind of a diagram of what does it look like when we put those core systems together, and this is more of that one. It's more of an operational flow of how things come inside this one here. So organizing and again, understanding how your data flows, which direction it's going, which systems are connecting to each other operationally, you can kind of get an idea on that. So as you get this laid out there and you're really nailing your integrations to make sure that they communicate with each other really well, then you can start to say, okay, I need to add some append data, or I need to get some personalization, I need to get a chat feature, ABM, and that really builds onto this and augments and collects and organizes those thoughts and that data to get to the next point. So the next slide that I want to look at, it's similar to the end-to-end slide, but there's a couple ways, and I look at the end-to-end approach or the data approach. One of those ways is from what I call back to front, or from source to report. We go next slide. Right, keep going. I think I may have organized mine a little bit. There we go. So back to front, source to report. Back one. Sorry, there you go. Sorry, my apologies. So if you think of it in terms of what am I starting with, or what information do I have on hand, and what insights I can derive out of that, one of the benefits is knowing that I have that information and I can use that to create this report or this vision on that. So you can create reports more easily or more quickly with that. One of the downfalls of that is that it may not align specifically with what stakeholders are asking, so you may have some gaps there. So the other approach, which is front to back, is starting with stakeholder requests and working backwards from there. So you go to them, you find out what their needs are, what their requirements are, you scope that out, and then you say, okay, well, what do I need in order to tell this story that they're trying to tell? You may find that there's gaps in your information, and you may say, well, I need to clean up this information, or there's just this entire section of information missing. That may be your motivation for going out and finding a new technology that'll give you those insights and fill in that data gap. Benefit to that is greater alignment with what stakeholders are looking for. Negative to that is the data is not always available, so it may take some time. So like Maxine mentioned, you know, some of these tools, 6 to 12 month integration period, are they still going to be concerned with this in 6 to 12 months? We need to take that into consideration and use kind of our strategy to say, is this what we're building towards? Is this just a shiny object? Do we need to figure this out? Do we even have the ability or the skills to get that today? What's the alternative to that? So a real best approach is having a balance between that back to front and front to back view and approach, is to make sure that where there are gaps back to, from starting at the reporting and the output, you can kind of get creative with that. So next slide, there's one that says optimize stack. Yeah, so as we're thinking about optimizing the stack and trying to build it really into what we need to build a vision for the business, we have to kind of balance creativity and pragmatism and making sure that these things fit well together. Again, making sure your core systems speak the same language and that they're connected really well, and understanding when's enough. So tech, a lot of people like to think of tech as just, oh, I'll just throw a platform at it, or I'll throw a solution at it, it'll fix the problem. Tech's not really additive. You can't just add 10 tools at 10% efficiency together and get 100%. That's not how it works at all. And in fact, it's a multiplication factor, because you get a smaller fraction each time and more breakpoints and more disconnects that you have to go chase down and diagnose. And it just makes it more and more difficult. Next slide. So again, at the end of the day, yeah, we'll go back to that one. So Maxine mentioned some of this as making sure that you have the team strengths and skills for alignment, making sure that you're setting a realistic vision for the business of, if we want to do this, this is what I need. You may not have those skills on your team today. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. There's partners like Ascend who will come in and be a true partner and help you to get that vision, get that dialed in, and make sure to communicate that and be realistic about providing the team members or the skill sets that you need to get you started and to build that momentum and get you going. You can help fill in some of your team gaps with their skills and their experience as you're building your team, as you're building your stack, and as you're doing that. It's important to set milestones to stay on track and make sure that you don't lose sight of where you're going with this or what you intended to do, and then manage your progress and your perception of progress. It's not often that other people, our stakeholders, appreciate or understand the complexity of what we're doing with technology and stacks, and they may think, why isn't this taking 2 months instead of 6 months? To help with that and to help maintain that momentum, not just within your team, but outside, and buy-in from other people, you got to focus on what they can appreciate as well. So you got to know what they're getting. Sometimes that means giving them some of those small and shiny things that they're asking for, but making sure that they can see the benefit of what these solutions are doing for your system as well. So the last slide that I have is just, again, going back and making sure that you're focused on what to deliver for the business. Make sure that you know who your stakeholders are, what their goals and KPIs and what their buy-ins, what's important to them, so that you can always push the story back to them. They're going to take that information in front of other people, and you got to help make sure to tell their story with them as well. So Andreas will talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yes, let's go ahead and thank you, Benjamin. Let's bridge to Andreas, and again, Andreas kind of leads the tech stacks for Blue Jeans, yeah, I think we're going to hear some similar themes.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, absolutely. I think we've talked a lot about how kind of data is the foundation. And I truly believe that reporting is the tool you use to kind of tell the story of that data to your stakeholders and your external audience, right? And in order to tell that story consistently and accurately, you need to establish a single source for reporting. That's absolutely paramount, in my opinion. Now, the reason I say that is because if you guys remember from the very beginning, I said data silos are one of the most common pitfalls when it comes to a tech stack and the data that flows through it. And so essentially what I mean by that, and we'll go into an example of like a micro example of exactly what I'm talking about here, but you have core inputs, right? Separate systems such as your sales marketing tools, your CRM, your marketing automation. You have your data enhancement tools, your intent data, all of those things that grab data and add it to the data flow that's going through your tech stack. And during those different stages, during those different phases of data coming in, you're gonna have whatever system it is, whether it's a data lake, right? A complex kind of data layer where you can manipulate whatever you want, or if it's simply just your marketing automation tool not passing certain things to your CRM, for example, you're gonna have data manipulation, data consolidation, data cleanup, things that you as a tech owner are going to see and you're working every day in. Your external stakeholders are going to have absolutely no idea what any of that means. And so it's very important to establish that kind of transparency and really document, okay, in a marketing automation where we have certain exclusion lists, such as internal test data, competitor data, things that should never arrive in whatever your system of truth is going to be, right? So that is to say, you want to limit anybody's ability to go into these source systems and pull reporting directly out of those source systems, because they're never going to align to one. That's just kind of the nature of the beast when it comes to a marketing tech stack. And you go back one more. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is getting buy-in, right? Your data, your insights, what you're providing to the team are kind of used to build the reputation of your external stakeholders. They're used to kind of identify the successes of the business, you know, and so you need to make sure that when you're getting into the definition of what a KPI is or what a success is, it kind of, those two things align, right? The KPIs for your reporting and the stakeholders' KPIs need to align for the success of the business. Go to the next one. And so when we talk about establishing KPIs, really it's establishing them, but then reestablishing them. KPIs are always going to be iterative. There are going to be data sets that simply don't exist in your current stack. And there's going to be, you know, if somebody comes and says, I want to be measured on, you know, KPI X, and you only have a fraction of that data in the tech stack, it's very hard to deliver that report. So you need to know, you know, clear definitions, where the KPIs are going to be coming from, what source system they're going to become, and don't agree to KPIs that you cannot or you can't measure with your current data set. That's vitally important, because once you start doing that, then you start getting into some inconsistencies in data. And once you get into inconsistency in data, that's when you start getting the bias. You deliver reports from different systems that don't align, people are immediately going to jump on that and say, I don't trust this data. This source A makes me look better. The data should look like this. Whereas the source of truth is telling them maybe a little bit different. So it's very important to know that not all of your stakeholders are ever going to agree. That's just kind of the nature of reporting. Everybody's going to complain about, oh, why am I not getting credit for this? Why am I not getting credit for that? And that's why I go back to the clear definitions, right? We talk about, you know, leads, for example. Let's take leads, for example. What is a lead to a marketing person? It's probably just a name and somebody to, and in my example, I'll show you what I mean by this. But essentially, it's just a net new add to the database, right? Again, what does net new mean? Just a brand new name with just an email email, phone number, and company. Or is it, do you want to define it as, you know, if you do that, then I guarantee you your campaign members or your stakeholders that are going to come in and they're going to say, okay, I'm being measured on net new. I'm just going to go out and buy a list, because boom, there's a cheap way for me to get 100 net new ads. So it's very important to kind of clearly define, okay, when I say a net new lead, it needs to be somebody, you know, that's new to the database, that maybe has 1 or 2 follow-up activities in order for us to qualify that this is a legitimate lead. And that's just within the marketing department itself. Then you take that external to sales, and now you're talking about, okay, marketing is giving me 10 leads from the same company. In my opinion, that's 1 lead, right? So that's your ABM versus non-ABM approach. And so it's very, very easy for us to talk about the same thing and mean 2 completely different things. And so the last thing that I'll talk about bias is accountability is key, right? Anything that cannot be reported doesn't exist, in my opinion. If people want to be held accountable to it, if people want to be, you know, if their success is going to be aligned to it, it has to be in the system, has to be easily reported on. We go to the next section. So an example of what I'm talking about for data silos is what we're just going to do a simple campaign report. We're going to talk about a webinar. So for these, your core 3 inputs are probably going to look something like your web analytics tool, right? Because you have a web page that has your registration form. That registration form is paired into your marketing automation system. And that marketing automation system is where you're going to collect all the information, probably integrated with some form of a webinar program that's going to run your actual event. It's going to sync back the registrations, the attendees, the no-shows. You're going to have some kind of a conversion rate. And then you're going to push that information to your CRM to get those net new leads to your sales teams. So each one of those sources are going to have, you know, these different data points. So right off the bat, let's identify what are your key KPIs for this example. Are going to be registrations, attendees, and then let's just do a conversion rate. So we can go to the next slide. So we're going to run into issues with this if you're reporting out of different tools. So we'll start with, you can click one more time. We'll start with your Google Analytics, for example, your web trafficking tool. Maybe that shows that you have 5,000 visitors, you had 200 form fill conversions. Now, conversions in a GA tool is probably going to look something like an on-click event, or an event that fires when somebody lands on the landing page. Historically, those don't always match up one-to-one to your actual form fills, and that's because people click the button multiple times, people fill out the same thing multiple times, et cetera, et cetera. So click again. So now you get into your, okay, how many people did I actually get into my application system? Let's assume you got something like there's 20 people that filled it out multiple times, clicked the button multiple times, whatever. So you have 180 registrants. So right off the bat, there's a delta there, right? If somebody looks in the Google Analytics and says, I got 200 form fills, and then they're seeing in Marketo, I have 180, why is there a difference? And then, so say we have 60 people that attended, you have 120 no-shows, 33% conversion rate. Okay, that's great. Webinar has happened. It usually takes about 24 hours or some kind of a time frame to sync that attendee data back into Marketo. And then go ahead and click one more time. And here's your Salesforce data. And what you'll notice here right off the bat is like, okay, I lost 30 registrants. Why is that? Well, marketing automation is most likely going to be where you're doing some of your filtering, some of your data manipulation that stops, for example, employees, internal employees, maybe some competitors, whatever it is that you don't want to sync into Salesforce because you're going to be running your reporting out of your Salesforce. So if you lose 30 registrants because they were all internal, that's really not that big of a deal. However, if all 30 of those people attended, now all of a sudden your 60 attendees are going to drop to 30 attendees, right? Still have 120 no-shows, but all of a sudden your 20% conversion rate. And why that's important is because your external stakeholders that are going to be held to the success of this program are probably going to be the ones that are like moderators for your webinar. And they're going to see, oh, look, I had 60 attendees because they're in the actual event. And odds are they're already going to take that success, that story that they have gotten from what they've seen in that source system, and they're going to tell that story to somebody else. And then they're going to come back to you and basically want your data and insights to basically be what's going to prove their story to be legit, right? So if you can go to the next slide. And so it's very important to have a reporting suite that's clearly defined. Once again, it's easily accessible and it's easily defended. And what I mean by defended is fighting that bias. People are going to come to you in the webinar example and say, I didn't have 30 attendees, I had 60 attendees. It's like, well, if you actually read the documentation on how we do some of our filtering, you would know that there's some internal data that we're not going to credit for this webinar. And then, you know, that goes into another thing. And then transparency throughout the entire tech stack is absolutely pivotal. If people don't know what you're doing to the data, when you're doing it to the data, they're not going to trust that data, and your reputation is going to dissolve. And we all know reputation for having good data takes forever to build, and you can lose it in an instant, right? And then eliminate that bias when making changes. So in our example, they're going to say, I had 60 attendees instead of 30. Why is your system broken? You already have that bias in the back of your head when you go to even look at the data. So it's very important to have kind of an agnostic type of relationship with the data. The data is what the data is. Don't take it personal. That's basically what I say. And that's pretty much it for me.
Good stuff. Well, guys, I'm hearing some common themes, a couple up on the wall here, around data, around making sure the system's integrated end-to-end, organizational stakeholdering. I think I heard some traps, perhaps shiny objects. What would you say? What are you hearing as common themes here, or, you know, common wisdom?
I think focus and making sure that you have your source of truth, not just for your system, but also for the stories that we're trying to tell. Yeah, Laura said the same thing. So making sure that you have something to come back to each time when things are changing. Like, it gets challenging. You have days, weeks, months that are tough, but knowing what you're coming back to and the story that you're telling and the overall message of what you're trying to do, that's what really kind of helps to build that longevity of the data and longevity of the stack. Is, does it hold up over time? Are we telling stories that are for today, or for today and tomorrow and 5 years from now?
Yeah, and I think to just tackle on that is the data cleanliness side of it, right? Making sure that your data stays accurate, up to date. I mean, how many of us have dealt with old leads and leads sitting in your Salesforce for years, and you're like, does that person even work there? Or how many people have gotten, a message about, oh, are you still, working at this company? You're like, I worked at that company 5 years ago.
I think we could do an entire webinar on data cleanliness, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's an everyday struggle, I think, for everybody that has any systems experience whatsoever.
Absolutely.
Credibility of the data really stood out for me, guys, because I think what I heard was makes total sense. And with my experience, yeah, people will challenge the data. People will, in times throw rocks at the data. So making sure that that's put together and tight is a challenge.
I
And
think being
documented.
prepared for that kind of criticism is important too. So that's not something you want to try and fix from behind the ball, because if you're playing catch up with your credibility, it takes forever, like Andrea said. So you want to stay ahead of that. You want to set expectations that, hey guys, we are building this and we're in a dev space. We are going to see some discrepancies, and just give some of the common reasons why you see discrepancies. So there's no reason to get caught off guard by counts being off in one system or the other. That's super normal, and so the degree to which it's off can be a problem, but make sure that people are open to, make sure that people know that you're open to the feedback and that you're working on that stuff. I think that goes a long way in maintaining credibility. I don't want to be in a position where I have to regrow that credibility again, or reestablish that. It's tough.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you don't have a choice, right? Sometimes you inherit a system where people already don't trust the data. And then it's about, okay, how do I make iterative changes? How do I document those changes? How do I grow the trust in the data? And like you said, counts being off in different systems is going to happen every single day. But what is the reasoning behind those changes, right? Documenting that, making sure that people agree on, how the data should flow and what we should exclude and how we should do those manipulations.
Yep.
Yeah, and even when you're looking at how you disqualify leads, right? So somebody that was a qualified lead, they haven't talked to you in 6 months or 3 months. What is that cadence, right, to drop them back down? Leads in general are just a whole can of worms, right?
Oh, sure can be. Well, I'd like to open up the conversation to all the participants here in a few minutes. What I think we'll do for the sake of time, Laura will have a few wrap-up items to share. Let's just do that here in a moment. And then if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat right now. And then in a few minutes, we'll open up the mic for anybody who'd like to stay around, and we can talk and ask more questions. So, Laura?
Absolutely. Thank you for attending today. And if you have thoughts and feedback, we invite you to go to martechify.com. You can also check out our upcoming Martechify plans. We have an event coming up in September, and the date is to be announced. You can definitely sign up to get alerts on that. Additionally, we will be having the connecting online and offline channels as the topic, and some deep dives that will also be announced. With that, I would say put your questions in the chat. We would love to hear the feedback. We would also love to hear any topics that you're interested in the chat. So love to hear your voices out there in the community. Thank you.
Yeah, and for anybody who'd like to stay around, we can try to open up the mics. If you have an immediate question, feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. But maybe the technical team can start to open up the mics as well. Any questions? I'll ask one while we're waiting. So I'm going to kind of go back to the question. I know each of you are working in different sectors, different kinds of organizations, but going back to the whole question of how big and complex is that stack, and how much is it really changing each year? What is the management or the evolution of the stack? And can we hear a few more words from you around just what's in these stacks, and how often are you finding yourselves changing out components?
I think it depends on the situation that you're in, right, and how agile you are. So I know that there are situations where we'll have components that are purchased by not the marketing team or not IT, or purchased by like an adjacent stakeholder.
Yeah.
And then it's like you find out about it and you've got to roll it in, right? And so sometimes it happens. And again, you kind of got to anticipate that and roll with it. But I think it depends. It depends on contracts, again, on budgets and things like that. So I would say through my career, I've had at least like, anywhere from 1 to 5 integrations of new technologies or new platforms per year. And when it gets any more than that, it gets really complicated, because when you're trying to integrate and manage 5 new products and making sure they all speak the same language, especially if you're also trying to work on your core systems, it can be really difficult. Staying up with that and trying to make sure that the new technologies that are coming out also are leveraging open APIs and getting into some of that ability. So like you said, I get in the weeds and I get real deep. So one of the things that I favor and one of the things that I look for is, do these things speak with a good, clear, open API? Is there additional information outside of the out-of-the-box integration that I can look for and get some additional insights? Is it forcing me to use their reporting function within their platform, or can I pull that information into my platform and report on it? So that's a lot of the consideration I have. I leave like usability or user interface for like webinar platforms or event platforms up to the team that's going to be in there and logged in and using that. And so trying to align their needs with my needs on the back end, it can be a little bit tricky, and there's some compromise sometimes, but I think that's really kind of the important thing. And it also depends on if your core is set up to where you've got a good schema and you've got solid connections, it's going to be easier to bring things in and out than if you're still working on trying to get Marketo and Salesforce to speak the same language. Adding things on top of that's going to be pretty detrimental.
I see a question in the chat. How do you keep up with the new and emerging technologies? So yeah, how do you set your radar? How do you what does it look like to stay on top of emerging tools, and just so you know what to look at or what to consider?
That's a great question, because it's hard, right? I think from my perspective, I usually have an overarching view on, a larger scale of different marketing activities. And so each of the subject matter experts within their discipline is usually the one that comes and kind of says, hey, there's this thing we maybe need to look at. And so for me, I've kind of relied a little bit more on people that are ingrained in some of these tools a little deeper. For me, I look at kind of a larger scope. And so it's just kind of reading some of the, the different texts that, some of these companies are using. Obviously everybody knows ChatGPT and what that's going on in ImageGPT, and but that was all over the headlines, right? So that was an easy one for us to all kind of pick up on. So how do you find some of the more obscure ones? I think that's where the subject matter experts kind of come into play, because they're in those forums and they're looking at those specific pieces a little bit more regularly.
Yeah, I think having good relationships with people outside of your immediate function too helps with that. So I have opinions about how certain things are performing and how they're going, and so my eye might be drawn to those for replacement or substitution or something like that. But having good relationships with an ABM team or with the sales team or with some other functions, people you trust who can give you some feedback about, this might be great. You have to avoid the I think this is really cool information, so we should spend the next 6 months implementing this thing, but I haven't talked about to the audience who would be receiving this information. Like that also has to be managed. But I don't think as an owner of the stack, you can keep track of all of it. You have to have people that you can trust to give you feedback about what's new, what's cool, what's helpful.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, I think for me, it's kind of the, as your business evolves and as you get a little bit smarter about your stack, you're understanding the data a little bit better, maybe your need changes. And for me, the biggest driver of for new additions to the tech stack is usually driven by our own need for either more data, better data, things of that nature. So in my opinion, it's yes, we can keep, like we said it in the presentation earlier, don't buy the shiny new thing. just because you want to, just because it's the new cool thing. I think if you let the needs of the business kind of drive you at least into the space where you can look at specific competitors, of a different tool or what have you, or maybe the tool that you're having or the tool that you have, doesn't do everything you need it to do. Maybe you've outgrown that piece of the tech stack. That's generally where, for me, it's like, that's where I'm going to go and look for new cool additions to the tech stack, is to fix a need that I already have, to be honest.
Good points. I think we have a question from Sujoy.
Yes.
I do. Great presentation, guys. Thanks for the time. One of the things that I found useful is really setting the baseline for all of the different stakeholders. So when you think of any large Martech implementation, there are so many different stakeholders with varying degrees of understanding of what we have today. Everyone's pretty excited about where we want to go, but I think it's useful to have an understanding of what exists today. And not everyone really wants to go into the weeds. So I'm curious what you found to be useful to really get everyone on the same page, knowing that some folks may have no interest in doing so. So thanks for your response.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's taking how that specific integration tool, platform, whatever it might be, and highlighting the value to that specific role, right? So what's the value to sales? What's the value to marketing? What's the value to finance? Whatever it might be, right? Whatever it is that you're working on, because selfishly, people only care how something impacts themselves. And if you want them to support a tool or to want to get buy-in on a tool, helping them to see why this specific thing would be a benefit to not only their day-to-day work and might make their leads, like the lead quality, better. And I think that's, for me, the way that I've been able to work together with people that might not necessarily have initially jumped on board.
Yeah, and I don't think that you're ever going to get everybody's buy-in at the same time, right? So some of that is top-down. I think Maxine nailed it when she said executive sponsorship. It's going to be hard for other people to push back and argue with things if you've got top-down support. And I think that just making sure overall it makes sense for the business, you're going to have to drag some people along. In some cases, it's just like any kind of technology implementation. There's early adopters and there's laggards. Some of the ways to get people on board is just to design. You got to design operations to embrace that new tool. And so they may not initially want to lean in or buy in all the way, but making sure that you're making a good case for what you're doing and building it as a part of the operations going forward is a big deal.
Good deal. I see two more questions. Let me mention these, and then we'll do a little bit of jump ball here. grab whichever one. So I see a question around what have you ever seen a failed implementation? I think I know the answer because that can happen a lot. What does that look like? And there's a second question. What do you do? How do you optimize dashboards if the data in your systems are not tying out directly to what you have in the warehouse or the underlying data platform?
I can jump in on Jenny's question. I saw that one come through and I chuckled to myself. I think it happens a lot more than you probably want to admit, but I think it's defining what does failure actually mean? Is it actually not serving the purpose, or is it not serving the purpose to the extent that you expected it to? And so for me, I think nothing's ever like a true failure, because I learned more about that platform and tool and how it works. Just by, it's a big lesson learned no matter what. But a great example that pops into my head is I'm very big into, website personalization and how to, we bridge AI. And I was an early adopter in Lytics and bringing Lytics in to my website. And I did not do the proper planning. And that's why I emphasize planning, for that. And especially for something that can take a mind of its own, literally, and start creating things and doing things, and you don't have the visibility to understand or see what it's serving up. That's an instance where, we were not fully able to support it to its maximum capability. In the very beginning we were, But as it started to grow and develop and start using the AI and the machine learning, we were not able to really control it, honestly. And that's the AI piece of things is a whole other webinar itself too, because there's governance associated with AI that we don't even know how to scratch the surface.
World, whole new world ahead there for sure. One thing I was tempted to ask you, Maxine, that I think is related, it's not a failed implementation, but you mentioned the words kind of a tool that's half implemented. Does that any more to share on that front? Or I've seen in different organizations tools that are used but not well. Not in the human mention, used but not used well. Any comments, guys?
Yeah, I have one. I think for me, anyone who says that they've never had a failed integration or implementation is probably lying. Let's be honest. I'm not shooting 100% in my career, that's for sure. But I think part of that is trying to identify kind of like where the problems are. So let's take a Marketo to a Salesforce integration, for example. If you're implementing a marketing automation, and I did this recently, just a year ago, where I inherited a Marketo organization or a Marketo instance that wasn't running the way that it should, right? In terms of lead life cycle, how we're passing information from Marketo to Salesforce, what sales is then supposed to do. So you have kind of you have some tech pieces of it, and then you have some human pieces of it too. And for us, the biggest challenge was getting sales buy-in and getting their adoption to our new process. And I wouldn't say it failed, but I would say we had a very, very tough time getting that human piece of it going, that adoption going. And a tool that I could put I could put a Ferrari on the road, and if nobody drives it, it's not going to have an impact, right? And so I think pivoting and seeing kind of where the failures are coming, or where the difficulties are amounting is pivotal. And if you can get in there quickly enough and you can pivot and you can address those, then I think even the idea of a failed implementation, like you can at least salvage some of it, right? Like maybe you didn't get everything that you wanted, but you were able to pivot and get your stakeholders buy-in if you took some of it out or you added a little bit more. So I think for me, you iterate on implementations all the time. And what I draw up is kind of this is what I want it to be, is never going to be what it ends up being. You have to be very agile throughout the implementation process in order to get it to work.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things is just making sure that you've got that buy-in and trying to fail fast. So implementations and those technology things, they represent budget items that somebody had to go out and build a case for and put their neck on the line for. So there's that tendency to want to double down to salvage the investment. And you got to know what caused the failure. And so it's crucial for other implementations going forward, but also knowing where you get the buy-in. So I would say lessons I've learned from unsuccessful implementations is that one of the biggest things is just making sure that people aren't trying to wait you out and you've got buy-in, because at the pace that things move, there's kind of this underlying sense that, oh, if I just wait long enough, that'll go away and they'll give me something else and I don't have to learn it. That's got to be a focal point of trying to make sure that from a business perspective, not just do you have budget, but do you have leadership buy-in on making sure that this becomes a part of your process, and that people will hold other people accountable for that. So we talk all the time that, we're going to introduce this technology and it's going to make your job so much easier. Other people don't see it that way. Not everybody sees technology solutions as making their job easier, especially sales who don't want to get into a platform and do things like that or provide insights. As far as I'm concerned, the business is paying them for their work and their time, and if they want to get those insights from them, they got to bake it into their KPIs and their reward and their incentive plans. That's how you get that in, and that's how you get it built in. If you're scratching at the surface on the outskirts trying to tell people like you can make their job. I had a salesperson one time tell me that they were unwilling to click on a button that was literally 1 inch from the other button so that we could track the email and the CRM, because it was too complicated. So those are the kinds of little things that can trip up your integrations and cause something to fail because the button's an inch to the right of where they're used to clicking.
My goodness, yeah. Hey, thank you guys. I think we're out of time, but I really appreciate the fabulous insights today. Thanks to all the participants who are still there for the great comments and questions being asked. I sense multiple topics ahead, so the comment around some commentary around AI. Certainly, there's going to be AI things to talk about. AI governance might be a hot topic that came up in the conversation. And then Celia asked a really good question around dashboards and how do you reckon with data disconnects with your underlying data platform. So I think we're going to have to save that for a future discussion, but that's a deep running one too. That could be its own session. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Great insights today.